Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we are going to do an emulation showcase video on the Lenovo Legion Go 2. Now this is going to be a pretty quintessential Retro Game Core video. We're just going to go through all the systems from the easy stuff up to the hard stuff and show what this chip can handle. We're also going to focus on this big beautiful screen and how all of these games look on it. Now for the setup, it's pretty simple. I just grabbed all of these standalone emulators, things like RetroArch and PCSX2. I'll have it all listed like up above when I'm showing each of the games. And then I tied it all together using Emulation Station Desktop Edition. This is a front-end app that essentially allows you to navigate through your game systems, and then you can pick your game and then launch it from here. And there are a ton of different ways to get a setup like this, including standalone apps like RetroBat or other tools like EmuDeck. In this video, I just did it all manually. So let's start by talking about this display and how it works with emulation. So this is a 1920 by 1200 resolution display. It has an aspect ratio of 16 by 10. That means it's a little bit taller than 16 by 9. Instead of being 1080p, it's 1200p, and that's because we have these additional pixels at the top and bottom. And this is going to be great when it comes to retro game emulation. The taller the display, that means the bigger 4x3 content is going to look. And so you will see black bars on the left and right as I'm showing off these classic games, but it's really not all that bad. In addition, we've got an OLED panel, which means that the blacks on here are going to look really dark. It's just going to kind of blend into the rest of the bezels, which means that when you have this kind of pillar boxing, which is when you have the black on the left and right, it actually just kind of blends into the rest of the display. So I think it's pretty awesome. So there are a lot of emulation benefits to this display, the taller aspect ratio, and the fact that it's OLED. It's going to make everything pop. Now, one downgrade from the original Legion Go is that this one has a 1200p resolution as opposed to 1600p. That means that the pixel density on this is a little bit worse. Now, once you're at 1200p, I think that on any handheld, it's not that big of a deal just because the screens are so much smaller than, like, say, for example, a big screen TV. But that is going to come into play when it comes to stuff like integer scaling and whether or not you're going to get some perfect scaling and really balanced pixels. Honestly, I don't think that really matters again with a device like this because you can use really nice CRT or interpolation shaders to balance everything out. So the only emulation downside I can see here is that you are not going to have as much of a pixel density, but I still think it is decent on a 1200p display with OLED and then of course with using my favorite shaders. For this video, I'm mostly just going to focus on the CRT GOM Deluxe shader, which is one of my favorites. I think it has a really nice balance to it, a little bit of a curvature to the screen, and then also has that beautiful CRT effect, which makes the pixels look just a little bit more deeper, and it adds a layer of sophistication to these games, kind of like how they looked on an old CRT. The only last thing worth noting is that this display goes up to 144 Hz, but the only display options we have for refresh rate is 60 and 144. There is no option for 120. And this will come into play with emulation because at 120 Hz you can do things like black frame insertion or CRT beam shaders, but it's not going to work at 144 Hz, and obviously it won't work at 60 either. And this is a bummer because black frame insertion and CRT beam will reduce motion clarity and make these games look even better, especially when paired with a heavy-duty CRT shader. But unfortunately, because it only goes up to 144 Hz, you don't have the ability to use these features. It's just going to make the screen flicker a bunch. So in all of my testing, I did keep the refresh rate to 144 Hz just because that also reduces the amount of input lag. But otherwise, yeah, unfortunately, I can't use things like black frame insertion. So with all that out of the way, let's get to the good stuff and talk about games. We're going to start with the really lightweight stuff, Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but it is actually worth noting on this device that it looks pretty darn awesome. I'm running all these games in RetroArch with the Gambate core, and I'm using an LCD 3X shader to give it a nice grid overlay just to make it feel a bit like the original consoles. And at this setup, we're going to get an 8.3x scale and 7 inches overall of total screen real estate. So yes, these games are going to look massive. And with these lightweight games, it's not going to drain a bunch of battery. On average with Game Boy and Game Boy Color, it takes about 8.3 watts, which will give you a little bit under 9 hours overall of battery life. So it might seem a little bit strange to buy a handheld for $1,350 to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but if you happen to fire one of these games up, it is going to look pretty amazing, especially on this OLED panel. It's going to be very similar with Game Boy Advance, if not a little bit better, because the Game Boy Advance was a 3:2 aspect ratio, which is a little bit wider, which means it's going to be almost a perfect match for the 16:10 aspect ratio that we have natively on this display. These games are going to scale up to 7.5x and 8.4 inches overall in total screen real estate. These are a bit more demanding on the battery, 9.2 watts, but still over 8 hours of battery life when playing this system. Moving on to 8-bit and 16-bit home console systems, so there's a couple things to note here. Number one, these are those true 4x3 systems, which means you'll have those black bars on the left and right, but as you can see here, I think they are relatively minimal, and they just blend into the bezels and the rest of the display. For NES in particular, it's a great match. This is going to be a 5x resolution upscale, so it's a perfect integer scale, and it's also 7.8 inches in 4x3 screen real estate. And the same thing with Sega Genesis 4x3, it's going to give you a 5.4x resolution scale, and it's still going to be 7.8 inches. I think it looks great. And one thing worth noting with these two systems in particular, it's going to take about 8.8 watts per hour, so about 8.5 hours of battery life. So I still think that's going to be plenty of time to play all your favorite retro games. Now with Super Nintendo, it's a bit more demanding, so I would expect here 10.5 watts per hour on average, depending on the game. So about 7 hours of battery life, just because the combination here of this big display, as well as, playing a Super Nintendo game, and then also that CRT Geom Deluxe shader is a bit more demanding. And so that's why we are seeing a little bit of a decrease overall in the battery, but still over 7 hours, no complaints from me. Another 4x3 system that I think is totally worth it on a Legion Go 2 is playing old arcade games. These naturally will usually be around 4x3 in an aspect ratio, which is going to give you that same 7.8 inches or so when playing in 4x3, and I think it looks awesome. Combine that with a CRT Geom Deluxe shader, you've got something that just kind of looks and feels like an old school arcade. And the battery life is not going to be bad on this either. It really depends on the game, but the average in all the arcade games that I played was 5.5 hours of gameplay time. There's obviously a lot of variety when it comes to arcade games, so don't take that as gospel fact for every single game, but I think this gives you a pretty good indication of what to expect. Now, one of the cool things about the Legion Go 2 is it's got those detachable controllers, which means you can just rotate the display and then play vertical games in Tate mode without really doing any sort of tweaks. You just have to go into Windows, change it from being a landscape display over to a portrait one, and the games are just going to run like this. So if you are looking to play some vertically oriented games, this is one of the easiest ways to do it on a handheld by far. That, of course, is going to apply to other systems like Nintendo DS and Nintendo 3DS. You'll just be able to rotate these over and then have the screens top and bottom. And yeah, I think it's a pretty neat experience all around. Nintendo DS in particular is a really great fit because these were both identical 4x3 aspect ratio screens, which means they fit almost perfectly in that 16:10 display. All I do at that point is just add a little bit of a bezel between the two screens, kind of mimicking the old hinge that we had on those old devices, and that's really about it. Of note, in previous videos I have shown off this 3D printed attachment which allows you to play games vertically, but unfortunately the new Legion Go 2 is larger than the old Legion Go 1, which means it doesn't fit in this one. So hopefully the vendor who made this initially will make a Legion Go 2 version, and I'll leave their shop link down below on Etsy. That's going to make it even better to be able to play these vertically oriented games. It'll be a great fit. Okay, moving on from there, let's talk about some of those 3D based retro systems. We'll start with PS1 and kind of work our way across the rest. So with PS1, I played it in RetroArch using the Beetle PSX HW Core, 5x resolution upscale, that CRT Geom Deluxe shader again. So expect about 5 hours of battery life when playing this way. For Nintendo 64, it's very similar. I upscaled it to a 1200p resolution, used that same CRT shader, and this one's a bit more demanding. The average I got here between all the games was a little bit under 3 hours and 45 minutes of gameplay time, but I still think it looks great. I love this combination of upscaling a game and then also using a heavy-duty shader. So it's like CRT effect, but also super crisp and sharp. So I really do enjoy this overall experience. I did the exact same thing with Sega Dreamcast, which is not quite as demanding as Nintendo 64 when you have that upscale going on. So here we are at a 1200p upscale, same shader, and it's taking about 15 watts as opposed to around 20. So we're going to get close to 5 hours of battery life this way. So if you're looking to play a bunch of Dreamcast games, this will be an excellent fit too. One system that's pretty darn challenging to play is actually very easy on the Z2 Extreme chipset that we have within the Legion Go 2. So here I'm playing Sega Saturn using RetroArch and the Beetle Saturn core. This is the one that's the most accurate of all the cores, but also the most demanding. But to be honest, this chip just cuts through it anyway. So you can play all these games no problem with that CRT Geom Deluxe shader. It's going to take about 17 watts, so a little bit over 4 hours of battery life when playing Sega Saturn. And when you combine this with the OLED panel, it's hard to imagine there's any better way to play Sega Saturn. We've got this nice CRT shader, really vibrant colors, excellent performance, and then also 7.8 inches here at a 4:3 aspect ratio. So it's massive and beautiful. Another pretty demanding system is Sony PSP. This is a 16:9 system, which means that we're going to have letterboxing, and that is the black bars at the top and bottom, but they're relatively minimal. This is the same as playing, any other 16:9 game on a 16:10 display. To keep things simple, I just actually ran this on RetroArch instead of using the standalone emulator, but a 4x resolution upscale still does great. It demands about 18 watts, which is going to give me, again, about 4 hours of battery life. So this is an excellent way to play just like crazy big PSP at this point. Now let's move on to Gen 6 systems. This is where things get a little bit tougher to run, but to be honest, this chipset can play them no problem. So we're going to run everything at a 3x resolution upscale. That's going to basically max out the pixels that we have available on the Legion Go 2. And so this is about as good as it's going to look, and it's not going to be super demanding either. On average, when playing GameCube, it took 15.5 watts, a little bit under 5 hours of gameplay time when playing Nintendo GameCube. I think that's a pretty awesome balance all around. And as far as compatibility and overall performance, I had no issues with all the games that I tested. I probably tried out maybe 20 or so, and every single game played at full speed. I didn't have to make any sorts of adjustments here, other than just to set it to the Vulkan backend 3x resolution and then just enjoy it. Now moving over to Nintendo Wii, it's the same Dolphin emulator, same settings and everything, but it is a bit more demanding to play these games. Now, in general, it's not too bad. It's like 17.7 watts per hour, so you're still going to get like 4 hours of gameplay altogether, but it is worth noting it's not quite as good as GameCube, but very close. From there, let's move into PS2. We're going to use the PCSX2 emulator directly from their website. Again, a 3x resolution here, and I use the Vulkan backend. And same thing here, where I didn't have any performance problems as I was playing, but it was more demanding on the battery. And that makes sense because this system is generally harder to emulate than GameCube, and so yeah, it requires a bit more juice. On average, between all of these games, both good and bad, I got about 24 watts battery drain, which is going to give you a little bit over 3 hours of gameplay time. A lot of these games have built-in widescreen support, and so if you want to play with widescreen hacks, you can absolutely do that. But if you also just want to stick to a 4:3 aspect ratio, I think that's one of the benefits of a 16:10 display, is that honestly, either one is fine for me. Either I can have some black bars on the left and right, or a little bit at the top and bottom, but they both look very good. And like I said, performance was just fine with PS2, so no issues here all the way up through the system. Another system that performs very well is a Gen 7 one. This is going to be Wii U, using the latest CMU emulator at the 1080p resolution. It's usually that by default with most of these games, but I also did go into the graphics packs and set them to that if possible. Other games actually have 16:10 support, for example, Hyrule Warriors. I'm going to blur this out because it has Nintendo IP in the footage, but you get an idea here that yes, it's running at full speed and absolutely fine. Same thing with Breath of the Wild. I got an average between 40 and 45 frames per second at a 1200p resolution. Now, this of course is going to be blurred out as well, and it is also worth noting that it is pretty demanding on the battery on average when playing Wii U, so about 30 watts per hour or a little bit over 2 hours of gameplay time. Regardless, if you're looking to play some of your favorite Wii U games, as long as it's compatible with the emulator, chances are it's going to run just fine here. Now at this point, you're probably thinking, all right, well, this obviously can play everything, but there are going to be some hiccups. We'll start with the original Xbox. Now, I'm running this with the latest ZEMU emulator and at a 2x resolution upscale until I can't anymore. Now, many games will run at full speed, but others will struggle, and it's kind of hard to read with the ZEMU emulator in particular because MSI Afterburner, which is the software that I'm using to show the stats on the top left, it doesn't provide a very good accurate frames per second with this particular emulator. Instead, you have to open up the video debug menu. And so this will be the actual frames that are printing on the screen, and it often will not be a stable 60 frames per second. Now, many of these old Xbox games did not have a stable frame rate anyway, but if you're looking for something that's enhanced a little bit more, this isn't really going to cut it. And that's just kind of part and parcel with this emulator in particular. It just kind of struggles on everything. So the way I see it, there are going to be games that play well here, and it is a bit better than the original Legion Go 1, but I wouldn't recommend anybody buy any handheld to play original Xbox just because the emulation still needs more time to cook. Now recently, the Xbox 360 emulator, which is called Xenia, has been doing actually a really impressive job. And so many games not only play well, but they have a lot better compatibility than they did just a couple years ago. The only drawback of this system is that it is power hungry, and so it's going to take that full 35 watt TDP if you let it. And honestly, I would recommend trying that out just to give it that much more of a buffer when playing these games. And as I showed in my overall review of this device the other day, pushing it to a 35 watt TDP will give you about an hour and a half of battery life. So that's what you can expect. Honestly, I usually will just play this system plugged in, so that way I can really push that performance as far as I can without having to worry about that battery life. I also use an app called Xenia Manager, which allows me to upscale all these games to a 1080p resolution, which is going to be a perfect fit for this display. Now, compatibility is always going to be an issue with work-in-progress emulators like Xenia, but I was surprised to find that even some of the more challenging ones like Last Remnant and 2 Human actually were looking very good in terms of compatibility, and they were playing at full speed. So in general, yeah, I would say that this is going to be a pretty good Xbox 360 system. It's also a very similar experience with PlayStation 3, maybe even a little bit better, because many of these games can be played on battery and they're not going to drain too bad. On average, I would say it takes a little bit under 25 watts for a lot of these lightweight and middleweight games, which will give you about 3 hours of battery life. The RPCS3 emulator usually has some pretty good compatibility compared to the Xbox counterpart. So if there are any particular Gen 7 games that you want to play and they were multi-platform releases, I would recommend trying them out on the PS3 emulator first before hopping over to the Xbox 360. Either way, I found that at a native resolution, you can basically play through most of the PS3 catalog up through those middleweight titles without even really worrying about battery, because you'll get about 3 hours of game time. Now, once you get into the more heavyweight games, this will be more demanding on the system and usually will pull closer to that full 35 watts. So this again is about that spot where I would rather just plug it in than worry about battery life, which will again be about an hour and a half. This is also a great way to show the upper limit of its emulation power, at least right now with this emulator. And let's start with Prince of Persia. So this is a 3D game. It's a little bit more demanding to try and run on emulation. And natively it ran at 30 frames per second, but you can use additional mods and whatnot to bring it all the way up to 60. And for the most part, it'll get pretty close to 60 frames per second. It really depends on where you are in the area, but even in this open area, you can see that it really only dips down to maybe like 55 or so here and there. So I think that this is actually going to be a very playable experience and much better than on original hardware. Now, this game's available on Steam. You can play it on PC. You'll probably get better performance that way too, but it's always nice to use a tried and true game like this for emulation testing. Another great test game is Infamous, one of the hardest to run games on this system, and you'll get an average about 45 frames per second at the native resolution. And I think it looks great. Again, this is a game that usually ran around 30 frames per second, so as long as you stay above 30, it's going to feel ultra smooth. In fact, better than it did on the original system. And then finally, with this system, God of War 3 is like the last one I always like to test, and this one gives me an average of about 50 frames per second. Again, very similar to the other two, where it usually ran around 30, and as long as you stay above that, it should be pretty good. And 50 is going to feel a lot smoother. And so, yeah, this is a totally playable game here, unless there are any compatibility issues, and I didn't really find any so far. For this system, it is also worth going to the RPCS3 compatibility database, and for games like God of War 3, they will have a bunch of options and suggestions to make this game run better. So I do recommend with these harder to run games, if you are running into any compatibility or performance issues, is to go onto that database and check it on their homepage, because this will often have the solution right there. Okay, and finally, the last system that I wanted to test in this showcase is going to be Nintendo Switch. Now, most of the Switch games that I like to play on these handhelds are Nintendo games, so I'm going to blur them out, but we'll start with one that is not from Nintendo, and that is Sonic Superstars. A couple things worth noting: I'm running it in docked mode in Eden, which means that in general, it's probably going to be at a 1080p resolution depending on the game, which will max out the pixels on the display anyway. On average, this emulator will hover around 25 watt TDP to get full performance, and that is going to drain the battery about 2 hours of gameplay here. Now, Eden is a fork of Yuzu, which is an emulator app that was taken down about a year and a half ago. And so since then, we've had kind of slower updates in terms of compatibility. So if there are any more recent games, like modern games, they may not run as well as, some of the older titles that had a lot more time in terms of development. But in general, I found that I didn't have any compatibility issues with a lot of the favorite games that I like to play when emulating on a handheld system. The way I see it, I like to back up and play a lot of my Nintendo Switch games on handheld PCs like this, just so that I have access to everything all in one handheld. But in general, I wouldn't think of this as a Switch replacement. Most of these games are probably going to run better on the native device anyway. But if you are into Switch emulation, it does look like the Z2 Extreme is an excellent setup for this. So really, that's about it when it comes to my emulation showcase. It's kind of short and sweet. I just wanted to kind of run through all the systems and show you what I saw, and honestly, everything works pretty well. You are going to have some caveats there, which are very typical. You know, original Xbox emulation has compatibility issues, and you know, there are going to be some Xbox 360 games that may also require a bunch of power to actually run, but in general, you can play basically everything that's out there right now. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you have a Legion Go 2? Are you ordering one? And are you going to play emulation on it, or just stick with your PC game library? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.